Well, today's program deals with the so-called French paradox, the name given to the irony that the French consume more dietary fat, jog very little, and smoke more cigarettes, but have a heart disease rate much lower than Americans. Regular consumption of wine appears to be a factor. Now, I don't know about you, but when I heard this, I certainly wanted to learn more about it. Many Americans first learned about the possible positive effects of alcohol when Dr. R. Curtis Ellison was featured on the CBS show 60 Minutes. Dr. Ellison is with us today to tell us more about this phenomenon. He has been the chief of the Evans section of Preventive Medicine and Epidemiology and professor of medicine and public health at Boston University School of Medicine since 1989. He serves as a senior investigator in the Framingham Heart Study, a longitudinal research project that has been studying risk factors for heart disease for more than 40 years. He knows from where he speaks. With training in internal medicine, cardiology, and epidemiology, Dr. Ellison is currently working with colleagues in France, Great Britain, and Canada in an attempt to understand the French paradox. Today's program is made even more enjoyable and perhaps a bit healthier by the wine provided on all of our tables, courtesy of Women for Wine Sense. Women for Wine Sense is an organization dedicated to educating women about the responsible and moderate consumption of wine. We'd like to thank them for donating this wine, and as well to thank the Good Samaritan Heart Institute for helping to make this program possible. I would like to also take this opportunity to point out that this program comes to the club during National Heart Month, immediately before the first annual National Wine Appreciation Week and the week before Oregon's first Wine Week. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellison to the City Club.
Thank you very much, Patty. It's a real pleasure to come here. I've been here for about 2 days, and I think I'm beginning to know why so many people like to live in Portland. I won't spread the word back in Boston. I'm sure you don't want any more Bostonians. I'd like to personally thank Dr. Oakes and the Good Samaritan Heart Institute and Karen Hinsdale, the Oregon Wine Producers and Women for Wine Sense for such an enjoyable visit and for helping support this. They've gone out of their way to make me feel at home, even to the staging of a snowstorm just to make me feel like I was back in Boston. You really didn't have to do that, Karen, but I'm what is known as a preventive cardiologist. Now, I'm not treating people with heart disease, I'm trying to prevent it. And actually, we've had some success. In the last 25 years, the heart disease rates in the United States have dropped dramatically by about 50%. This slide, which you will be able to see in a moment, shows the causes of death in the United States, and even though our rates are dropping for coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, heart attack, you can see from the white area of the slide that heart and other cardiovascular diseases still make up the largest part of the causes of death, about 46% now, about twice as common as deaths from cancer. So even though we've made a lot of progress, we still have a long way to go, and the leading cause of death of all Americans, including women. In fact, more women are now dying of cardiovascular disease than men at somewhat a later age. This has occurred because we have changed our dietary habits to some extent, and for a long, long time, as long as most of us can remember, we've been getting messages from the American Heart Association such as, don't eat the eggs for the cholesterol, don't eat the red meat and the bacon because of the saturated fat. And they've even gotten around to attacking our tropical oil so that you can appreciate a cartoon that says, uh-oh, Carol's inviting us over for cake, and I'm sure it's just loaded with palm oil. Now, is it any wonder then that after such a negative, don't do this, don't eat this, don't eat this for a long time, about a year ago, some good news came along. First, I read an article that said foie gras was good for you. Now, French scientists have found that red wine actually cleanses the arteries of cholesterol. I love the French. is this true? Is this just a very clever marketing scheme of the wines and foods of France, or the Oregon wine producers, or the California Wine Institute, or is there some truth to it? I'd like to spend a few minutes going over the evidence that we have that says, first of all, do the French have less heart disease? And then see if we can tease apart some of the reasons that may be contributing to that. Now, we have known for a long time, this is a very complex slide, but I just wanted to point out that the death rates from heart disease vary dramatically by country. We used to think that, heart disease, you get old, you get your arteries plug up, you get arteriosclerosis, you die, and you get senile, all this. But this is not common in certain parts of the world. Whereas Northern Ireland, Scotland, Finland, and many of the other Northern European nations have very high rates of heart disease, ranging up to around 400 for men per 100,000, 130, 140 for women. At the very bottom of this scale is Japan. For every person in Japan who has a heart attack, every man, 10 men in Northern Europe have a heart attack, die of a heart attack. The same for women. We can explain this in Japan because the traditional Japanese diet has had very, very low amounts of fat for all of the years that the 50, 60, and 70-year-olds have been eating. They've been eating a traditional Japanese diet that is very low in saturated fat, about half, less than half of what we eat. But we cannot explain this nation right next to it, the lowest of all of the Western nations, France. France has lower coronary rates than in Greece, than Italy, than many of the other countries that are eating what we think is a very good diet, the traditional Mediterranean diet. And yet France is consuming a diet that is higher in fat, and it's very difficult to explain why they have these low rates. Well, first of all, we didn't believe them when they said that, these many people die from heart disease. We thought that they had trouble counting. Or we thought that, they were not diagnosing heart disease the same way the rest of the people, like the English and the Americans were diagnosing it. Someone has a chest pain and falls over and dies, and they say, the liver got him. And so we really didn't quite trust the French when they said, we don't see heart disease. We said, you're just not looking for it or something, or you don't know how to diagnose it. But the World Health Organization in 1982 started a group of studies in 26 nations where they were monitoring standard groups of people to see how many had a heart attack, and they were following very strict and standardized criteria. So if someone has a certain finding in one nation, they were using the same criteria for the other nation, and guess what? The French were telling the truth. The French have lower heart disease rates, 79 and 13 for men and women. Look, compared with Finland, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, about the same, around 400 versus less than 80. Five-fold difference between France and Finland, Northern Ireland, Scotland. Women, huge difference, tenfold difference between some of these nations. So indeed the French, even when we're sure they're counting right and we're sure that they're using the same criteria, they have much lower rates of coronary heart disease. But we talk about the French paradox. We don't talk about the Spanish paradox. You'll notice that the Spanish rates are not that much higher. So why do we talk about the French paradox? This is because if you look at the total intake of dairy fat, or of total fat, or of saturated fat, or of animal fat, and the risk of coronary heart disease death, you see it pretty much of a straight line. There's a kind of a grouping of nations down here that take in very little dairy fat, and these that take in a lot of dairy fat, and there's a very striking relationship between the amount of dairy fat that a nation consumes and its coronary heart disease death rates. But France is an outlier. France, if they're really eating 600 calories per day from dairy products, they should be having 200 heart attacks rather than less than even Spain, Portugal, and Italy, the other nations. So indeed, it is an outlier, and it stands out. Well, maybe there are other risk factors. Maybe it's something else. Maybe they're eating this horrible fat diet, but maybe their blood pressure is lower. Blood pressure is the same. Same percentage of people are treated for hypertension. Drug therapy and so forth is very similar. Maybe they don't smoke as much. If any of you have been in France lately, you know, if you've been reading the news about how the how the French are trying to get smoke-free zones in their restaurants. It's comical. The last time I was there, I said, "Do you have a smoke-free table?" They kind of looked at me. Then they led me to the basement, you know. They have one table set up to meet the law, the requirements of the law. So they smoke more. Their blood pressure is just as high. Well, maybe their cholesterol doesn't go as high. We are working with two of these monitoring sites that the World Health Organization set up, known as MONICA. One is in Toulouse, France, which has the lowest rates in all of France. This is in the southwest, south of Bordeaux, between Bordeaux and the Pyrenees. It's the land known as Gascony, the land of D'Artagnan and the Three Musketeers. And we're also comparing it with the area in Monaco that has the highest rates in the world right now, Belfast, Northern Ireland, the same as Glasgow. It's not due to the trouble, it's due to other things. And you can notice that the death rates are very strikingly different. For women, 11 and 88. For men, 78 and 348. So there are huge differences in the coronary rates, and these are kind of the two extremes of Western Europe. So maybe their cholesterol is lower. Look over here. The cholesterol of the men in Toulouse is 230 average. That's higher than Americans. That's the same as the people in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So wait a minute now. The cholesterol is high. They smoke cigarettes. What's going on? We don't know what's going on, actually. And I should sit down and say, I'm sorry we don't know, but at least I'll, since I'm up here, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we are theorizing and what information we have on this. And I'm going to list three main hypotheses that we are currently considering. We are working with people in Belfast, in Toulouse, and in Massachusetts. The first hypothesis to explain the so-called French paradox is that they're getting more antioxidant vitamins. And if you've been reading your latest magazines or your newspapers, you've been hearing the antioxidant vitamins, beta-carotene, or vitamin A, vitamin E, or tocopherol, and vitamin C. Maybe Linus Pauling was right after all. Vitamin C, vitamin E, and vitamin A are known as antioxidants. And these are vitamins that we've known for a long time that tend to prevent cancer, but we now know they also prevent heart disease. We now know that the French in Toulouse have twice as high levels of these antioxidant vitamins in their bloodstream than the people in Northern Ireland. Why? We think it's because they're consuming more fruits and vegetables. Further, they're fresher. They're not getting things that have been shipped from around the world, that have been sitting in the supermarket first and then in the refrigerator. They go out and buy their fruits and vegetables in the morning. They still go to the local markets and in many of these areas, even in the cities. So they're preserving the antioxidant vitamins that are in these fruits and vegetables. And they don't overcook them. So they serve vegetables raw or with short duration of cooking. We know that in comparison with Northern Ireland, they're eating more fruits and vegetables. In some interviews with women in Glasgow and Northern Ireland, I remember one lady said, you know, do you serve a lot of greens, green vegetables to your husband? And she said, oh, yes, I fixed him some lovely greens. Let's see, was that this year or last year? The typical man who's having the heart attack in Ireland these days very rarely eats fruits and vegetables. It's meat and potatoes, and they are not getting these protective antioxidant vitamins that we know the people in the south of France are doing. So this indeed, I think, is one of the significant differences, one of the factors. We have not yet done the studies in the United States, but I think that the antioxidant vitamins will be higher, although I don't know how much higher they are in France than they are in this country. Now, a second hypothesis has to do with the types of fat. We know that the total amount of fat being consumed by the French is the same. You know, we're supposed to get our total fat to 30%. The American Heart says most of us are taking 32, 33. So we're taking a little bit above that, but they're taking 35, 36% of their calories from fat. And the saturated fat, they're taking 15%, much more than we are. So, oh my goodness, they should be dropping like flies from coronary disease. But they're getting less of it from red meat. If you'll notice that red meat, as you know, it's served in smaller portions. You'd never go into a French restaurant in Paris and see a big slab of, 18 ounces of steak or something like that. It's smaller portions, and it's much lower in fat. We've been analyzing the lean tenderloin in France and the United States, and in France it's running 2 or 3% fat, very, very lean, because they do not use the feeding pens, they do not fatten up the animals before slaughter. So their beef is much leaner and smaller portions. So they're getting less fat from the red meat, they're getting more of it from cheese. Now, there's this wonderful theory out there that cheese, somehow the saturated fat in cheese is not as harmful, is not as atherogenic in terms of producing a heart disease as in whole milk or in butter or in cream. And I think it's true epidemiologically. You saw the dairy fat relationship with the heart disease rates. You get the same thing for butter, the same thing for milk, but if you put in cheese, you get no relationship. We don't know why this is, and we don't even know how it applies to humans because most of the studies have been done in rats. And if you're a rat in Dr. Serge Reynaud's laboratory in Lyon, you do much better if you eat camembert or brie than if you drink whole milk. He's given his rats the same amount of fat, saturated fat, all should be equally bad for you in these different forms. Those who consume the milk start developing the atherosclerosis, start developing the heart attack risk. Those who are given camembert or brie, it just kind of passes through and doesn't increase their arterial disease. Finally, in terms of different fats, we know that olive oil is good for you, and in Provence, in the southeast of France, they use that, and in the southwest, in Gascony, where they have the lowest rates, they're using goose fat. Did he say goose fat? This is what the people in Gascony are eating, folks. This is a picture of a huge glob. This is some duck, and this is duck or goose fat, and the huge amount of goose fat is being fed to the people there. I saw this in the window there when my wife and I were forced, for scientific reasons, to spend a couple of weeks in the southwest of France last summer. It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. But we found, we wanted to see what the people were really eating. You know, we read what the scientists write, and maybe we're losing something in the translation. So we began following the trucks around, and when the truck drivers pulled in at 12 o'clock sharp, noon, into the restaurants, we pulled in with them to see what they were eating. And they were eating, you'd find goose fat in little tubs to use rather than butter. They were doing all of these things, a high-fat meal. They were sitting there smoking like mad, you know, and they weren't that lean. They were a little bit overweight. And I said, geez, if this were in America, they'd all be dying of coronaries before they got to the age of 50. But they were doing it, and they were getting away with it because this is the area of France with the lowest rates of heart disease. Goose fat, it turns out, is about halfway between butter, which is bad, and olive oil, which is good. It actually has twice as much of the monounsaturated fat, goose fat, and even chicken fat to some extent. They're not as bad as we once thought they were, but indeed they are fat. But the truck drivers were doing they're doing two other things. They stayed there until 1:30. They spent an hour and a half for lunch. Now, how often, well, you do it once a week, but I mean, how often do you spend an hour and a half in your busy day and try to enjoy a lunch? They took an hour and a half for lunch. Even though they were smoking cigarettes and talking, they're doing everything's bad, they were taking time to enjoy the meal. And the other thing they were doing is that for each two men, when they sat down, there was already an open liter bottle of red wine. And that leads to our third hypothesis to explain the French paradox, and that is alcohol intake. We know that French take in considerably more alcohol. They take in about 10 times as much wine, but the total alcohol has increased over Americans as well. Now, there are several key things that we think may be playing a role. The key words are regular. We've known from many studies that alcohol consumed in binges is very harmful, not only for you and your family and if you be driving for others, but it's very harmful to the cardiovascular system as well. But taken on a regular basis, it tends to protect against heart disease by a number of mechanisms. The other key word is with meals. And many of us are beginning to think, we haven't proven this yet, but if you consume alcohol with meals, it is serving a different purpose. It's in making the meal more enjoyable, but it's also tending to affect the absorption of the fat that you've had in your meal. It's making the effect on your bad LDL cholesterol less, and it's affecting the platelets so that they're favorably improved. If you have the alcohol kind of covering, you know, diabetics, if they have an extra big meal of carbohydrate, they have to take extra insulin. Maybe people, if you have an extra load of fat, you have to cover with a little bit of wine. Finally, the alcohol that they drink in this part is almost exclusively wine. They're drinking very little of beer or whiskey, and we're finding that within France, the areas that consume predominantly wine have considerably lower risk of heart disease than those in the north, and particularly around Alsace-Lorraine, Strasbourg, in the border with Germany, where they're consuming much more beer. It seems to be that the wine has more protection than the other types of alcohol. Now, this is not a new story. This is a study from 1979 that it shows the mortality rates from coronary heart disease related to wine consumption. And we knew back in '79 that Finland, the US, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, all the old British Empire has very high rates of heart disease, very low intake of wine, and France and Italy and Switzerland take in more wine and have the lowest rates of coronary disease. But these are countries, and there are many differences, and so it's nice to see that among individuals, there were 10,000 British civil servants who were followed by Marmot and his colleagues, and they found that for individuals who consumed no wine over this 10-year period, about 6% died from heart attack, and a total of about 10% died. For those who stated that they drank about 1 drink a day or about 3 drinks a day, heart disease rates were much lower, which you can see here, and the rates of other types of disease remained low until they got up to the high level. The total mortality is shown here. This is the so-called U-shaped curve, or if you continue it on up, a J-shaped curve. Individuals who drink none at all have higher death rates, particularly from cardiovascular disease, than individuals who do not drink at all. Now, this should not be a surprise because we have known for a long time that there are a number of biological, physiological mechanisms that that we would expect alcohol to protect against heart disease. The one you hear about mostly is the HDL, the good cholesterol. That is the factor that the part of the blood that picks up the bad cholesterol and carries it to the liver to get rid of it so it doesn't settle into your artery. And one of the main factors that tends to increase HDL cholesterol is alcohol. Alcohol and exercise, about the only 2 things we know will increase it. It also reduces the bad LDL cholesterol. It affects thrombosis, and this is a short-term effect. It reduces your platelet aggregation for a period of a couple of days. But then if you have a lot to drink, you have a rebound, and the platelets get more sticky. This is the same as aspirin. Many men are now taking an aspirin a day or every other day to prevent a heart attack. Similar mechanism from alcohol. A little bit of alcohol tends to reduce the platelet aggregation. And there are many other factors that are listed. It's hard to study some of these, but we do know a recent report that the estrogen levels in premenopausal women are very protective against heart disease. Heart disease is a major cause of death for women after the menopause, and if women are taking a small amount of alcohol on a regular basis, the estrogen levels are higher, and that may be the mechanism by which it is protecting. Some of these are long-term effects. It depends. You know, the French have been drinking wine with their meals. They're now 60 years old. They've been doing it for actually about 50 or 52 years because they started very young. But they've been doing it, so this has built up their HDL and lowered their LDL to some extent. But some of these are very short-term factors, and therefore it is interesting to see a study from New Zealand where these were drinkers. There were no abstainers among this group, but they said, what is the risk of myocardial infarction depending on how much you have drunk in the preceding 24 hours? These people, even though they're drinkers, had had nothing to drink in the 24 hours. These individuals had had 1 to 2 drinks, 3 to 4, and so forth. You'll notice that in comparison with drinkers who had had nothing in the preceding 24 hours, the risk of having a heart attack for those who had had as little as 1 drink was cut in half for men to 0.56 of the risk. For women, even more, to 0.34. The risk was reduced by 2/3 if they had had something to drink in the preceding 24 hours. You're okay until 1:45 tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen. After that, you're on your own. Now, let me just briefly mention the question that I get asked frequently, is it just red wine, or is it just wine, or can I continue my cocktail or my spirits or my cognac or whatever? We don't know yet. If you look at the countries, those who drink wine do much better than those who drink predominantly beer. This is a study among young women who had myocardial infarction, heart attack. In comparison with women who never consumed any alcohol, with the risk of 1, what was the risk of a heart attack for those who normally consume mainly liquor, or mainly wine, or mainly beer, or more than one type? And you'll notice that all types of alcohol cause some reduction in the risk of a heart attack. Here, the wine had the biggest effect as well. But this is hard to understand, because we know that wine drinkers are different from beer drinkers. I mean, there are differences. Wine drinkers, we know, are more intelligent, they're prettier, they have better education, and they have a healthier lifestyle to begin with. So we don't know, is it that the fact that they're healthier and drink wine, they don't die because they're healthier, or they don't drink because of the wine? So this is always a difficult problem to tease apart. But Dr. Klatsky at the Kaiser Permanente group in San Francisco recently reported that indeed, among his people, controlling for all of these factors to the extent that he could, he found that wine drinkers still had at least 20% lower risk of a heart attack than those who drank other types of alcohol. And everyone who drank alcohol had a considerable reduction in risk of a heart attack than those who did not drink at all. But still, it's always hard to tease apart. Is it really the healthy lifestyle, or is it the type of beverage being consumed? So it is reassuring to have this study of comparison of red wine, white wine, whiskey, ethanol, and beer, and atherosclerosis among rabbits. Now, these poor rabbits were forced to eat this horrible diet of eggs and butter and typical American diet for a period of time, and they began to develop atherosclerosis, and the coronary arteries started sealing up with lesions. And the doctors Chlorfield and Krzyzewski, who did this, compared the percentage of the coronary arteries that had been obstructed. In the control group, these poor rabbits only got water. The rest of them got beer, and in this particular study, there was no protection from the beer, moderate protection from the whiskey or the ethanol, more protection from the red and white wine. The numbers were too small to know whether there was a significant difference between the red and the white from this particular study. I don't know if red wine is better. I have a feeling that over the next 5 years, we will find that red wine has additional substances, such as resveratrol, which is this magic material that's used as a folk medicine in Japan, that comes from red, that's more in red wine. It comes over from the grape skins. But we just don't know. We cannot prove for sure yet. We have good data saying that wine seems to have preference over other types of alcohol. The regular use of wine is better than doing it occasionally, and you certainly can't save up for the weekend and use your quota on Saturday night. But we're not quite sure if the red wine or white wine is preferable. Probably, I think the red wine will win out in the end. Let me just mention briefly before I end, there are adverse effects of alcohol, and the big concern, the reason that the physicians have not wanted to spread the word even sooner to the American public is alcoholism is a major health problem in the United States. In terms of cirrhosis, in terms of cancers of certain type, they're essentially those of alcohol abuse. These are alcoholics, or people who are indeed consuming vast amounts, bottles rather than glasses of wine or particular other alcoholic beverages. There's one cancer that there's legitimate concern about, and this has to do with breast cancer. We know that in some studies, women who are consuming even moderate amounts of wine have an increased risk of dying from breast cancer. We have not found that in Framingham. The women in Framingham that have been followed now since 1948, who consumed alcohol, about half of our women consumed some alcohol, they have actually lower rates. They had no increase in breast cancer rates. And it is reassuring that at least in the 3 wine consuming countries, Italy, France, and Spain, where the women are taking in at least 10 times as much wine as Americans, the breast cancer death rates are actually lower than they are in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the U.S., where wine is not consumed. That it still may be that there is some increase in breast cancer from even moderate amounts of alcohol, but the data just aren't clear enough, and it may be that the antioxidant vitamins and other things are protecting these women from breast cancer. The net effect of all of this is total mortality. What is your chance of dying of various diseases? And it's shown here. This is the largest study done in the United States. In 1959, 1 million Americans were interviewed by the American Cancer Society. All of their lifestyle habits were recorded, and they were followed up over the next 12 years. This is among about 43,000 men who died. You'll notice that in comparison with those who consumed no alcohol, and this was about half Americans in 1959, no alcohol of any type, those who drank occasionally or averaged 1 drink or 2 drinks a day had a lower risk of heart disease, as you can see, coronary heart disease, but they also had lower risk of everything, and their total mortality, the all-cause mortality, was higher for the heavy drinkers. That's when cirrhosis comes in, certain cancers, accidental deaths, and so forth. But for the moderate drinkers, there was not any increase. In fact, there was a decrease. And I've just completed reviewing a large number of every study published in the last 6 years that looked at mortality, total mortality, not just heart disease, and we see the same pattern. In all of these instances, the individuals who consume moderate amounts of alcohol on a regular basis live longer from all causes. Now, I'm not one who sets policy. I'm a scientist trying to get the data. Now, how do you use this? How do you spread this message to the American people? I'm not a specialist in that. I think the just say no policy of our federal government is not a particularly good one. I don't think there's any evidence that this tends to prevent alcoholics from drinking. It does not seem to be preventing the development of alcoholism. So I think that indeed just say no is not the approach. I think that if everyone in America stopped drinking today, it would be a social disaster, from lots of husband to wife shooting each other when they don't have their drink to relax. And further, it would be a medical disaster, because coronary heart disease is still killing 1 million Americans every year, and indeed moderate alcohol consumption is preventing some heart disease. On the other hand, I think we all have to realize that too much is too much. And individuals who are going to abuse alcohol, individuals who've had problems with any type of drug problems in the past, the correct amount for them to drink is 0. The correct amount for someone getting ready to drive a car is 0. So I think taking these into consideration, we still have to conclude that in moderation, moderate amounts of alcohol is consistent, particular wine is consistent with a healthy lifestyle, but even this isn't new. St. Thomas Aquinas said many years ago, if a man or woman abstains from wine to such an extent that he does serious harm to his nature, he will not be free from blame. Thank you.
And with that, we'll go to questions. The first one will be from Andrew Wheeler, followed by Mary McCarthy from the floor, and I would invite you to line up at the microphone behind Mary for any questions that you may have. Andrew?
Thank you, Patty. Dr. Ellison, you are a bearer of good news. I propose a toast to you, the messenger. And for the radio audience, I'd say, lift them if you got them. When you get together with your colleagues from Canada, Great Britain, and France to examine the French paradox, how do you conduct your research? Is it ever pleasant?
There are real problems in trying to see what it is among the French that are protecting them. Many of my colleagues say, well, obviously, the French don't have heart disease, the joie de vivre. I mean, you know, they're happy, less stress, and it's very hard to measure joie de vivre. What kind of instrument do you use to apply equally to people in Massachusetts and people in Northern Ireland and in France? So there are many factors, and we actually do agonize over trying to identify. It may be that it's something other than the wine, other than the antioxidants. We're trying to cover all of these, and our attempt, as any epidemiologist, is always to make sure that your results are not being confounded by something else. Indeed, it's difficult, but what we're trying to do is to recruit a large number of the areas that are being monitored by these MONICA sites and to follow them and do very intensive lifestyle evaluations. So we go into the homes, we'll visit these people several times over a period of a week to 10 days. We will measure their blood pressure, we'll look at their cholesterol, we will follow them around to see how they prepare their foods, how they purchase their foods. We'll put monitors on them to see if they are exercising more in France than they are in Ireland and the United States. All of these things, trying to cover all fronts so that when we finally put it all together, we'll say, indeed, the data suggests that this is playing this part of the protection.
I'm Mary McCarthy, member of the Science and High Tech Committee. There's been a lot of interesting discussion about non-alcoholic beer in the media and for sale, and I wondered if anyone has studied non-alcoholic wine and whether or not that has any protective effect. And could you comment a little more on what has been done to try to find what the chemical might be in the red wine that could be protective?
Yes, there are studies going on currently looking at resveratrol, which is one of the chemicals that's been found in red wine much higher than in white wine, to see how it works. And that leads to your first question. It is being tested. Resveratrol does come across from the vine, from the skin of the grape, into grape juice. So not surprisingly, Welch's is sponsoring a large study to see if grape juice with resveratrol has the same protection against the blood lipids, the cholesterol, the platelets, the thrombosis, and all of these things in a group of people. In general, we don't know the answer first about what proportion is coming from the alcohol. We think that probably half of the protection from alcoholic beverages is from the alcohol itself. So a non-alcoholic drink will obviously not have that part of the protection. But there are 200, 300 active chemical substances in wine. And we've only begun to look at one or two of these. We know that resveratrol is present in the grape juice before the fermentation starts. We know that some of the antioxidant vitamins are there. We know that a chemical known as quercetin, which is protective against stomach cancer and perhaps other cancers, is not in the grape juice. You can detect it after about a week of fermentation, and it takes some time. That only comes across in the wine. So the answer is yes, some of the stuff may be there in the grape juice or the non-alcoholic beverages, but we don't know the answer yet. I'm sure that you'll never get all of the protection because part of it is from alcohol itself. We see that. That's why we commonly see that alcohol in any form has protection.
Doctor, I'm Rich Pope, a member. As a physiologist, I commiserate with you with some of the difficulties that you have in conducting this research in France. It must be very difficult. I know of one person, Pinckney J. Harmon, who was a neurologist studying the spinal cord of the lobster. And of course, they had to get rid of that carcass by eating them. And that must have been very difficult, too. My question is, do you need a good research associate?
It's amazing the number of volunteers I've had for our research. Unfortunately, now I'm having to send my nutritionist and my dietitians and my epidemiology associates to France to work out the nitty-gritty, and I'm not getting to go myself very much.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. As an Italian-born American, I'm a little bit disappointed to see the Italians below the French. But in any event, the question that I have deals with the antioxidants that you mentioned before. And one of the illustrious children of Portland, Linus Pauling, for years has been a Nobel Prize winner, for years has been advocating high consumption of vitamin C as being a panacea for a lot of things. I guess it's an anticlimax to wine, but what do you think of that?
I'm sure, or I think, that the antioxidant intake of the French is indeed helping protect them. We know that vitamins A, C, and E are all important, and they're synergistic. And if your vitamin E is the one that's particularly protective against the oxidation of your bad LDL cholesterol, and if it's used up, vitamin C will stimulate it to become active again. So there's the interaction of all of these antioxidant vitamins. Most of the studies done in Europe point out that if you look at the vitamin C intake of a population, the vitamin E and the vitamin A and the fiber and all of the other things that come mainly in fruits and vegetables, you still do not get as close a correlation with protection as from the consumption of fruits and vegetables themselves. Because these antioxidants in a diet such as the Mediterranean diet, that you have fruits, vegetables, grains, and so forth, you're getting these in maybe the proper proportion. I get very upset when people come up, there's a new Frenchman who has this new wonder diet, and there's grapefruit diets, and all of these things. We have a diet that the people in southern Italy and Greece have been eating for 2,000 years. And the people in these areas have the lowest rates of heart disease and the lowest rates of cancer and live the longest. So we have a good diet. It's known as the Mediterranean type diet, and it uses olive oil and it cuts down on the red meat considerably. So I think that in all of these studies, the fruits, vegetables do better than the individual vitamins. Now, in some studies in the United States, people who were taking multivitamins did better, but we've not yet teased apart if the vitamin C is being protected. We know that beta-carotene is protected. We're not sure about the vitamin C. But I think right now, I think it's much healthier to don't worry about taking, oh, it's vitamin E this week and vitamin A next week and vitamin C. What's the right proportion? Nobody knows. If you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, if that's the mainstay of your meal, you're going to get those that you need and you're going to be much healthier.
Joe Lieben, City Club member. We've been hearing about protective qualities. Are there any studies that have been conducted or are underway that reveal any kind of reversing qualities to these three different possible theories, or just stopping progression of atherosclerosis that has already set in?
Most of my work has been in the primary prevention of heart disease. I like to get a nice group of young children, young adults, get them to adopt a healthy lifestyle and never develop atherosclerosis in the first place and never have the heart attack. One recent study has just been completed in Lyon, known as the Lyon Diet Heart Study, that involved what we refer to as secondary prevention. These are individuals who have had a myocardial infarction, had a heart attack, and were then put on a diet and followed over a period of up to 5 years. The results have not yet been published, but they're going to be astounding. Dramatic lowering of recurrent rates from individuals who went on more of a Mediterranean diet with fruits, vegetables, maintaining their wine, than individuals who maintained their usual diet or even tried to just push up the polyunsaturated fat, trying to balance out to meet the American Heart Association diet. So I think what we're coming to is rather than focusing just on fat and cholesterol, oh, don't eat this, we should be saying eat more fruits and vegetables, bringing up that. In this group in Lyon, they had very dramatic reduction in second myocardial infarction if they were on this Mediterranean type diet. There are other studies that if you cut the fat down very, very dramatically, as Dean Ornish and his group in Southern California have done, and go through all of the other things, you can get regression. So I think don't give up. I mean, you can have a very narrowed artery, and two things can happen if you keep eating a terrible, triple bacon burgers or whatever it is. Some people eat for lunch and dinner all the time. It will continue to plug up. But if you switch to a more of a healthier diet with lower fat, or particularly with more fruits and vegetables and with a little bit of wine, it will not progress, and it may regress a little bit. But more important, the blood clot, there's the thing that plugs it up and causes the heart attack, may not occur. If you're having just the right amount of wine and just the amount of antioxidants, all of these things, you may keep this narrowed artery until you're shot at age 93 or something. You may never have your heart attack because it will stop it at this stage of development.
John Bartley, member. I noted your data had some interesting correlations. The Northern Irish and the Scottish correlated.
Yes, very closely.
They're also very similar because most Northern Irish are from Scotland. The Germans were similar to the United States. Germany is the #1 country of origin for American citizens. Have you done a study to look for genetic correlations, perhaps looking at people from Quebec who had French forebears to see what relationship genetics might have in these matters?
It's a very good question, because the first thing that many people say, well, maybe these people in Gascony are so mean or so tough, or this is the survival of the fittest down there. They were killing everybody else with their swords, and only the strongest survive. There have been two things that have addressed that. First of all, we have indeed looked at the French Canadians who, in Montreal, who have ancestors still living, so they're fairly recent immigrants in the last generation or so. Their eating habits are as bad as ours. In Quebec, they've cut down on their no longer having wine on a regular basis. They're beginning to, switch to, I don't want to name any brands of anything, but they're drinking soft drinks and they're drinking beer and whiskey and other things, but they're not drinking wine as a part of the meal. They're eating a very high-fat diet. They're snacking the same as we do. Their pattern is almost identical to that in Boston. So these people have adopted the American lifestyle. Coronary rates in Montreal are higher than they are in Boston now. So Canada has the same, they've adopted the same lifestyle habits, and this is what we've seen in other populations who move to the United States. They very quickly, or move to Canada in this case, they very quickly adopt the disease prevalence rates of the country. Let's see, one other question you'd, what was the other one? Oh, the genetic, I'm sorry. The genetic markers, there are certain types of cholesterol that are determined by genetics. Your total cholesterol, your grandparents determine what it's going to be. You start out at a level of, say, 180 or something, and then if you're a terrible eater, you can go up to 200 or 300, or if you're a really good eater, you can drop it down to 160 or something. So indeed, the total cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the apolipoproteins and so forth are all determined to a large extent genetically. Some studies have just been completed and reported from Toulouse and Belfast, identical. So we have no evidence thus far that genetic markers, that genetics is the reason that the French have much less rates, both the migration studies and the comparison of these genetically determined lipids.
Dr. Ellison, Bill Crane, City Club member. I was sorry to hear you classify wine as an alcoholic beverage. It seems like calling meat a protein or good bread a carbohydrate. I've lived in France a lot and just was there a couple of weeks ago. I wonder if you'd comment if you've examined the question of the fact that there is a great deal less pasteurization in France. We eat an awful lot more germs in France than we do here. A lot of good things that we can eat in France we can't get in this country. Food is eaten in courses. You never eat the really fat stuff until after you've eaten the salad and so forth. And most of all, have you examined the question that people in France drink wine that comes out of the same ground as the food they eat? You know, nobody in Gascony would drink Cahors with a cassoulet, and nobody in Périgord would drink Burgundy with truffles.
These are very good questions. Many of these things are extremely difficult to measure. We're going to try as best we can to get information on all of these things that may be confounding the picture. We will be recording the time spent at each meal. We'll be recording how many people normally do you have dinner with? Is it just you by yourself, or you and a spouse, or is it the extended family? All of these we hope will give us some clue as to some of these factors. The wine seems to be protective. Studies in California, studies in Japan, everywhere you go, even though the wine is not grown in these areas, it seems that the alcohol and the wine are protective. So I don't know if there's any magic marriage of food and wine, although it is very nice if you're traveling in France to have the local wine with the local specialties. Some of this is hard to measure, some of this we hope to measure, and some of this is just probably we won't be able to do. The question on pasteurization, I don't know the answer to that. I've learned several things recently that we will include in our data. We'll look at the pasteurization. We'll look at the way water is purified. I was told that water in France is not purified using chlorine, but usually with ozone. So there are other differences in that we have a laundry list. Pasteurization of products, homogenization of milk has been suggested, a lot of other factors, chromium and all of the other, selenium, many other products. We'll be assessing these as best we can. We'll do this by looking at people who, within each site, within France, within Northern Ireland, within Massachusetts, that have a heart attack in comparison with those who do not, to see if they are different. That may give us some clues and things that are common across all populations, which we assume cigarette smoking will be, and we assume that alcohol, although finding enough Toulousians who don't drink wine may be difficult.
Dr. Ellison, in your biographical sketch, it referenced the Framingham Heart Study, and I wondered if you could just give us a little bit more background about that study. It's been going on for a number of years, and really what's entailed in it.
Just after World War II, heart disease rates started going up, and if you read Doonesbury last week, you know why. Each time we have a war, we suddenly flood our young men, in particular, and now young men and women, with cigarettes, and cigarette consumption increased dramatically after World War I, and for the first time, lung cancer began to appear, and a little bit of heart disease. And after World War II, cigarette smoking was kind of pushed on every American who went to fight for Uncle Sam, and indeed, heart disease rates went up. In 1947, the U.S. Public Health Service began to recognize this, geez, we're seeing all these young people falling over and dying of coronaries. This is something that we didn't see back, in the previous generation. And some studies were done among soldiers who were killed in the wars, and they began to see that these were healthy, normal men, but they had lots of atherosclerosis. This was particularly emphasized in the Korean War and the Vietnamese War, where the coronary arteries of the Vietnamese or Koreans were completely clean, the ones who had been killed, whereas you could recognize this was an American by the plaque, all of the milk and cheese and other saturated fat that was plugging it up. So in 47, the Public Health Service started looking around for a community to say, gee, we really need to find out what's going on. And one way of doing this is measure a lot of things in the population and then follow them up to see if we can learn from this follow-up if we can predict who's going to develop a heart attack. They looked around and they found this quiet little community known as Framingham, Massachusetts, and they started what is known as the Framingham Heart Study, and now 45 years later, many of the 5,300 people, 5,100 and so people who are still alive are coming back every 2 years to be examined. We have people from Florida, we have people from California, I don't know if they're Oregonians, but people who used to live in Framingham, they still try to come in every 2 years to be examined so that we can continue to follow them up, and we have very complete follow-up of over 98%. From that study, after about 10 years, it was very clear. The individuals in 1948 and 49, when they were first examined who smoked cigarettes, they were dropping sooner. They started saying, look, we have twice the rate of lung cancer and twice the rate of heart disease, even as early as 5 and 6 years. That they've now published the 35-year follow-up, and indeed many of these risk factors that we all know about were originally either came from that study or were confirmed by that study, and it continues to this day, looking at now the second generation, and I've recently got a small group of the third and fourth generation, so we have 4 generations of some families now being followed by the Framingham study. It's a long-term prospective study that has helped us tease apart some of the factors that we all hear about. Everyone in Framingham was living in the same area. Some of them were smoking, some of them were not. So we could follow up those who kept smoking and those who stopped smoking or those who had never smoked. Some of them were drinking. We could follow up every 2 years those who were still drinking, those who were not. And this is what a lot of our risk factor information has come from that particular study.
You bet.
If the French aren't dying from heart disease in the rate that we are, what are they dying from, and do they live longer?
Well, first of all, the French do have heart disease. The leading cause of death in France is heart disease, but it's occurring at 87 rather than at 65. It's occurring at a much later age. They're dying of old age. They're dying of their cancer rates are about the same. They do have heart disease, but it's at a much later age. The risk of dying for all of us is 100%, so you have to die of something. But the fact is that we'd like to stay as healthy as long as we can and delay that as long as we can. So heart disease is the leading cause of death in France, but it's at a much later age. Total longevity is also greater in the south of France. At several years, they're living several years longer on the average than Americans are.
Susan Stone, member of the club. If wine can have a protective effect in terms of fat and heart disease, what role can it play in weight control, and has that been studied?
This has been studied to some extent. Alcohol in different forms, not necessarily wine, but we find a funny thing. If we look at two populations, if we look at the drinkers and the non-drinkers, we find that the drinkers are a little bit leaner, they're no fatter, and yet they're taking in more calories. And if you try to put the calories in there, it seems that the alcohol calories, even though they should count, they don't seem to be counting. The more alcohol you drink, the less of other foods you will drink. And in some parts of France, I mean, 30% of the calories are coming from alcohol. I'm certainly not recommending that. But it seems that if you add a couple of hundred calories or 300 calories from alcohol, it does not increase the weight of a population. We don't know why. It's been postulated that the alcohol goes in and poisons, if you use that word, certain of the enzymes in the liver that relate to weight control, and that maybe you could comment on that. Yeah, it's been suggested that it's metabolized faster, but it doesn't seem to go to the hips and the belly. So. That seems to be another side effect. If it turns out that a little bit of alcohol reduces weight, I think we really have something here.
In closing, I'd like to call your attention to the blue cards that are on your tables. You'll see that in celebration of National Heart Month and Wine Appreciation Week, that local wine merchants that are listed on your card and wineries will donate 10% of sales made this Saturday to Good Samaritan Heart Institute. And as Dr. Ellison says, heart disease is still a big problem in this country. And in closing, we'd like to thank him very much for coming today to City Club and sharing with us the facts that he has. Thanks, and we're adjourned.